Hi, this is Editor Troxel. In today's tutorial, we're kind of going to do the opposite of what we did in the previous tutorial. In the previous tutorial, we imported a bunch of images onto the timeline based on an XML file. Now, we want to assume that we've made some changes to the events on the timeline, maybe change their position, change their length, and we want to export a new XML file based on those changes. So let's see how we can actually export the timeline instead of importing. So here's a look at the XML file that we imported last time. We can see it's got the version and encoding information in the top, and then it's got this information here. We're going to assume that this information basically hasn't changed a whole lot, but I am going to change the title to be the name of the new title that we've given the file. And I'm going to change this information and this information so that it does indicate the proper first in time code and last out time code, as well as the proper number of events based on what is currently on the timeline. And then, of course, all of this will be totally generated from the timeline events, and so it will list each event and give the new in location, the new out location. The width and height will stay the same because the images are not changing, and that's pulled directly from the images. The X and Y will stay the same, although we are pulling that from the project itself. And this will stay the same, and we are going to pull that from the actual media. So let's see how we can create this file. I've added this main variable so that we can have our character encoding set to UTF-8, and that is used when we actually create the XML file so that we have everything in the correct formatting. Then in our main routine, we're setting our myVegas equal to Vegas, and then now I want to have a save file dialog. Previously we've been using open ones. This one is a save one, so I just named it SFD, and this is a new save file dialog. Once again, we set the initial directory. I set mine to the same folder as the previous tutorial. Once again, change this to wherever you want it to be by default. Once again, we set the filter to be XML or star.star, and by default we want it to be XML because that's what we are going to export. And then our filter index we set to 1, and our restore directory we set to true. Then we open the save dialog, and if they clicked on OK, then we know that they have entered a name, and so we will go in and first of all are going to look for a selected video track. So we're going to go for each track, my track, in myvegas.project.tracks. If the track is selected and it is a video track, because we can only process video events if it's a video track, then we are going to export the XML, and we are going to use the save dialog file name, and we are going to use the track that we just found. And then I put this break in here because we only want to process the first selected track. So make sure you've got one track selected, and that is the track it's going to process. So now let's look at this export XML. Before we get too far, I did create a couple of subroutines down here that I want to look at first. First, we have an add child, in which we are sending an XML element and a child name. This one is actually calling the second routine, which is called child string, and it passes the parent, the child name, which both were passed to it, and null. So we can call child string directly if we want, or we can call add child if we want it set to null. So child string is getting the parent, the child name, and a child value. And what this will do is create a new XML element called child, and it will be from the parent .owner document .create element, and then it's going to create the child name. Then it's going to append that child to the parent, and then if the string was not equal to null, it's going to set the inner text equal to that string. And then it will return the child, so it returns the XML element we just created so that we can do further processing with it if we wish. So let's go back up and see how we actually use those. So now that we've got the file name and we know which track to use, the first thing I'm going to do is create an XML document. So XML document, doc equals new XML document. Then I'm going to get the processing instructions, and to do that we use a doc.create processing instructions, and then I'm going to pass it XML and version 1.0 encoding UTF-8. So it's going to create the XML and the version and encoding information. So if we come back and look here, it's the XML entry here. Then we'll have a version 1.0 and encoding UTF-8. After that is done, we will append that child to the document. Next, I'm going to create a root element. And this is doc.createElement, and the name of it is BDN. So if we look here, we have a BDN, and then we have all kinds of pieces of information here. So I want to duplicate that information. So the first thing I'm going to do is in root, I'm going to do a set attribute, and then we do the version in 0.93 so that it matches what was in the file before. Now I'm going to do a root.set attribute, and we pass this information here along with the web address, and then we also do the root set attribute with a no namespace schema location. We pass that same address again, and then we pass the other information that was on that line. So then we do our document.append child, and we append the root that we just created. So if we go back to here, this will give us our BDN, everything that you see in this line, and ultimately it will also give us this /BDN at the bottom, because everything else we do, we're going to insert inside of root. So now let's do the description section. So this right here is our description section. So we have our description, and inside that we have our name, language, format, and events. And then all of this information will be inside those four pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new XML element called description. We're going to add a child, which is our routine from down below, into root, name description. Then we're going to create a new element called name, which I used a variable of name, and we're going to add a child inside description with the name name. So once again, over here we've created description, now we've created name, and now we need to put this information inside name. So what we're going to do is name.setAttribute, and then we're going to add a title, and then I'm going to get it from the file name that we typed in when we told it we wanted to save. And then we're going to do a name.setAttribute, name content, and we're going to put nothing. Just quote, and that will give us our title equals, and our content equals nothing. Next, we're going to add a new XML element called language. So we add child inside description again, called language. And then we're going to set the attribute called code to ENG. Our next line is format. So we're going to add a new child, once again, inside description, called format. Then we're going to set our video format equal to 576i, simply because we're matching what it was previously. And we are not getting this from the project information. So our frame rate we're setting to 25, and our dropped frame we're setting to false. Finally, using the variable ev1, we're adding a child called events. And then inside ev1, we want to set our type is graphic. Then our first in time code. We're actually going to get this from the project. So we go to mytrack.events.number 0, our first event. We want the start time code, and then we're going to convert that to string. And then for our last event out time code, we're going to get mytrack.events, and then we're going to look at mytrack.events.count -1, which will give us the last event. Remember, we're 0 based, so the count is the full number. Count -1 is the last one. Then we're going to look at .end and convert that to string. And then finally, we're going to look at our number of events, and we're going to get that from mytrack.events.count and convert that to a string. So this way, if we have removed any of the events, you will see that the count gets changed. If we've added any events, the count will get changed. If we've moved events around, then this first event in and last event out could also change. So now that all of that is done, this entire description section is finished. So we're done with all that description section. So now we're going to look at the events. Unfortunately, we only have to look at one of them, because the routine will just do each one as it comes to it. So as we go down here, we're going to look at all of the events, and now we're going to add EV2, which is also called events. I know it's confusing because we had one called events up here, but we're going to have another one called events, only this one goes inside root. Then for each video event inside mytrack.events, remember I can use video event because I checked up above to make sure it is a video track. Then we're going to create an XML element called oneEvent, and then I'm going to add a child inside the events, the second events called event. Then inside oneEvent, I'm going to set the attribute of in timecode to be the event.start and convert that to a string. Then we're going to set the attribute out timecode to be the event.end.toString. And then we're going to set the attribute forced equal to false. So if we come back and look here, this will give us our event section with an in timecode, an out timecode, and forced equals false. Now inside of event, we have to have this graphic line. So now let's go back and add that. For XML element graphic, this time I'm going to call child string because I do want something in it. If we go back and look at it, it's a little bit different. If you notice, we have the open bracket, we have all this information in the close bracket, then we have this information here, and then we have the open bracket / graphic and close bracket. So this is different than the other ones, and is actually the way the previous tutorial where we were importing XMLs were all written. They just had graphic and then a name and then / graphic and without any of these additional attributes. So we want to add this while we're creating the actual entry to begin with. So we're going to call child string this time instead of add child. Once again, this goes inside of event. So event is one EV, so that's what we're passing. We're going to call it graphic, and what I want to pass it is the path.getFileName, and then I'm going to get that from the current event.activeTake.media.filePath. So this will give me the same file name that was previously used. Now to get the rest of this information, I need to get the video stream. So the video stream, vs, equals event.activeTake.media.getVideoStream.index, and I want the first video stream. So the first thing I'm going to do is in graphic, I'm going to set the attribute width equal to vs.width.toString, because we're always passing a string. Then graphic.setAttribute height is the vs.height toString. Now I need to look at the actual keyframe in order to get the positioning information. So my keyframe is event.videomotion.keyframe, and I want the first keyframe because these events only have one. Then I'm going to get my float called x equals myvegas.project.video.width, so the width of the actual project divided by 2, minus the keyframe.center.x. This actually tells me how far off I had to move this event, so that's the positioning information that I need. And then a float y equals myvegas.project.video.height divided by 2 minus the keyframe.center.y. Now I'm going to take the graphic.set attribute. I'm going to set my x equals x.toString. Then I'm going to take my graphic.set attribute y and set it to y.toString. So now it's going to go through this loop and just process each event on the timeline, so every one of those entries will be made. Once all of those entries are made, now we actually have to save the file. So let's come down here and we're going to create an XML text writer, which I just called writer. It's a new XML text writer. We're going to pass it the file name and the character encoding, and this is where that new variable that we used at the very top comes into play. Then we want the writer.formatting equals formatting.indented. Then our writer.indentation equals 2. So each section is going to be indented 2 spaces. And then our indent character is a space. And then I'm going to doc.write2. I'm going to take the document, the XML document we created, write it to the writer, and then we're going to close the writer. So let's test it out and see how it works. So this is the original project that we had in there. I've really only changed a couple of events here. I've moved these two way far to the left and changed their length, and so we can test it out by looking at these 2 events right here. And now let's run Tools, Scripting, Run Script. And we're going to just call this Test Export. Notice I'm in the same folder as the original ones, but I am giving it a different name so that I don't overwrite our original entries. Now when we come into this folder, we will see we have a new file here. And when I open that up, you can see it starts with our XML version 1.0 encoding equals UTF-8. Then we have our BDN version 0.93 with all of this extra information added, just like was in the previous one. This one, we have our description, our name, our title equals test export. So that has changed. This has not changed. This has not changed. This has not changed. This one has changed. Our first event is now says it's at 711. Our last event is still in the same place. Our number of events is still 692. So if we come back over here, you'll see our first event was at 2:15:04. The rest of this would have been the same because they have not moved on the timeline. Then we have all 692 entries down here under events. So under events, we have an event with our starting time code, our ending time code. All of this is the same. This is the same. This is the same, even though this is all pulled from the project. So if we look at our original, we now have 711 and 2521. Previously, we had 2:15:04, 2:17:05. So it is now getting the new in and out positions. And we have all 692 entries listed. And then at the bottom, we have our /event, /events, and /BDN, just like we see over here. So now we've managed to import the subtitle files. We can change them on the timeline, move them, remove them. You could even add more if you wanted to. Then you can go in and export the information back to a new XML file should that information need to be moved somewhere else. So this has been an interesting little procedure that we've come up with, and so importing and exporting both the same information. And I hope you liked this tutorial. If you did, like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think and what you'd like to see. And we'll see you again in the next tutorial. Please sign up at www.jettv.com and subscribe on YouTube to get further notifications on when new videos are presented.